Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Spring 2017 International Speaker Series. My name is John Presnall, and I'm a professor of government here at the college. Our speaker today is Professor Minxin of Claremont McKenna College. He will speak on the topic of Chinese politics and its impact on U.S.-China relations. Before we get to the introduction, I want to thank several people for helping to make this event happen. I'd like to thank Dr. Warren Nichols, the president of the college, who unfortunately cannot attend today. He regrets that he had a prior engagement. I want to thank the College Board of Trustees and the Student Activities Board, Dr. Stephen Sewell, the Dean of Academic Programs, and Professor Stacy Henderson, the Chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences, for supporting this series. The International Speaker Series Committees works to arrange for individuals like Professor Pei to come to the college each semester and address important issues on international affairs. So I want to thank members of the committee as well. Dr. Samuel Layton, Dr. Ching Lee, Professor Rafael Naranjo, Dr. Cody Smith, as well as Ms. Henderson and Dr. Sewell. I also want to thank Kari Drake, Rebecca Sauer, and Giselle Hewitt for their assistance. Now to today's speaker. Professor Minxin is the Tom and Margot Pritzker 72 Professor of Government and the George R. Roberts Fellow and Director of the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies at Claremont McKenna College in Claremont, California. He's an expert on governance in the People's Republic of China, on U.S.-Asia relations, and on democratization in the developing nations. He earned his bachelor's degree in English from the Shanghai International Studies University and a master's degree and a PhD in political science from Harvard University. He's published in several journals and newspapers and has appeared, among other places, on CNN and NPR. His most recent book is entitled China's Crony Capitalism, The Dynamics of Regime Decay, published by Harvard University Press. It was named by The Economist magazine one of the books of the year of 2016. Today, as I mentioned, Professor Pei will speak on the topic of Chinese politics and its impact on U.S.-China relations. After his talk for about 40 minutes, we're going to open up the floor for a Q&A discussion. If you have a question, please wait for the microphone to come to you so that we can get it on the videotape here. So please join me in welcoming Professor Pei. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Presnall. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today. I want to thank Professor Presnall and his colleagues for inviting me here to speak on the politics in China and its impact on U.S.-China relations. I will start by giving you a very brief history of U.S.-China relations, primarily since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. In the last 68 years, U.S.-China relationship went through roughly 4 periods. The first period began in 1949 and ended with Nixon's dramatic visit to Beijing in February 1972. Of course, that was preceded with Kissinger's secret trip to China in 1971. In the first period, 1949 to 1971, the U.S. and China were deadly enemies. China was viewed as a rogue state. China and the U.S. were engaged in a kind of Cold War. But starting in 1971, U.S.-China relationship changed, and the two countries became quasi-allies in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. That ended in 1989 with the collapse of communism in the former Soviet bloc and with the Tiananmen massacre in China, 1989. Those of you who want to review that historic episode in 1989 can go on YouTube and watch various documentaries. That was the second period, the golden period of U.S.-China relationship. The third period began in Around 1992, then that's the end of the Cold War, because the Cold War took about 2 years to end, and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, December 1991. So in 1992, a new era in U.S.-China relationship began. And I would say that this period ended around 2010. How do we characterize this period? This is a period most people would say that U.S. And China were in a very strange relationship. China was neither a friend nor an enemy. So it's neither here nor there. A very ambiguous relationship. But roughly about 8 years ago, U.S.-China relationship had another turn. So today, it is what you might, politely, you might call, it is a strategic, the relationship is that of a strategic competition. That is, U.S. and China see each other as competitors. Competitors are still better than enemies. But the relationship today is much more adversarial than friendly. So it can turn the risk that the U.S. and China can become enemies actually are very, very high. What explains these changes? There were only two explanations you can use to understand why this relationship went through 4 different periods. The most important one is strategic interests. That is, both countries have fundamental national interests. When these interests clash with each other, they become competitors or enemies. When these interests overlap with each other, they become allies or quasi-allies. In the second period, I will skip the first period. In the second period of U.S.-China relationship, that is 71 to 1989, U.S.-China were brought together by one fundamental interest. That was the danger from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was threatening the survival of both countries. And it was that kind of fear that brought the two countries together. And it was a golden period because alliances are founded on the basis of fear, not basis of love. If you have read Machiavelli, Machiavelli would always tell you that fear forms a very powerful motivating force. And during the Cold War, there was no surprise, or it was not a surprise, that Nixon, one of the most fervent anti-communists in the US, would go to China. Because Nixon understood that in order to contain the Soviet threat, he had to have China's support. And Mao Zedong, who was an anti-imperialist, one of the most radical leftist leaders in the world history, he understood that the only way to save China from Soviet military attack was by forming a relationship with the US. And in the post-Cold War era, there was another basis of strategic interest, and that was largely economics and trade. That one is fear, the other is greed. You all know how people get motivated. And in the post-Cold War era, the U.S. had an option, 1992. The U.S. had an option of just leaving China alone, not engaging in trade or economic activities with China. But the U.S. decided to try a different strategy with China. The U.S. was very powerful, was the only superpower in the world in the 1990s. That was so-called the unipolar moment. And Bill Clinton had to, at the time he was the U.S. president, he had to formulate a new strategy toward China. And he decided on a very different strategy. By that time, the U.S. had nothing to fear in the world. The Soviet Union was gone. So fear-based cooperation was no longer necessary. But how should the US deal with China? There were people who said that let's just forget about China. It's not important. It was quite poor, and it was not militarily powerful. There were other people who would say, let's try to contain China, because China had all the potential to become a great power that could endanger the US. But a third group said, let's try a new strategy. That is, if we want to abandon China or leave China aside, China might be important. So we would forego lucrative business opportunities. And as for those who wanted to contain China, the third group would say, this is too dangerous. We just fought a Cold War. And if we want to contain China, then we would be in a new Cold War with another big country. And if you treat China as an enemy, as they would argue, China will surely become one. Why not try something very different? And something very different later became known as the engagement strategy with China. The essential assumptions of this strategy is that it is much better to have China inside the club, dominated by the US, than outside the club. Because once China is inside the club, China will develop interests, shared interests with the members of the club, which is the West. And then China will not become aggressive. Because once you have shared economic interests, you're unlikely to destroy those opportunities that generate economic interests. So this was the foundation of the engagement strategy. And there's another unspoken, or sometimes actually quite explicit argument for engaging China in the early 1990s. And the argument rests on this assumption. If a country becomes more prosperous, more open to outside trade, the country's values will change. People will become more pro-democracy, more pro-West. So over time, China will become democratized, just like us. So that once countries become democracies, the likelihood that they are going to be aggressive toward other democracies is very low. So this is the so-called democratic peace theory. And in the 1990s, this theory was very influential. So eventually, to cut the story short, the pro-engagement argument won, and that policy was sustained until quite recently, until 2010. But the outcome actually was very different. China did not develop in a way that those who advocate engagement expected or assumed or argued. So I will spend the next 15, 20 minutes explaining why we are now in the fourth period, that the US and China are now strategic competitors. Instead of becoming a friend of China, the US is now a strategic competitor of China, and vice versa. There were really 5 reasons. Of course, I can give you a long laundry list, but these 5 reasons are among the most important. Most of them have to do with politics inside China, politics and economics inside China. What determines relations among nations? If you boil it down to one thing, it's really the balance of power. If one country is more powerful than another, then the country doesn't have to fear the less powerful country. If one country is more powerful than another, then the country has more to fear from that country. So this is very simple. Why don't we fear Canada, for example, right? Canada has very large territory, but 27, 28 million people, no nuclear weapons. Nobody would go to bed worrying about being attacked by the Canadians. But why do we worry about Russia? A country in decline, and much poorer than Canada because it has nuclear weapons. Why are we worried about China? Because it's a really powerful country. So relations between China and the U.S. has changed primarily because China has become much more powerful and as a result, much more dangerous to the U.S. This is very simple. So let me just give you a set of numbers. You can see how dramatic the change in the balance of power between the U.S. and China has been in the last 25 years, 1992, because 1992 marked the beginning of the third period. In 1992, China's economic output, we call GDP, were measured in US dollar terms, was 6% of the US GDP. So it was tiny, right? There's a different measure of economic activities. I will talk about this later. But for the sake of argument, let's just use the dollar. Because dollar is a measurement of power. Dollar is an international currency. By the time, and that's the year Bill Clinton got into the White House, right, was elected into the White House. By the time George W. Bush was elected into the White House, 2000, China's GDP was 15% of the US GDP. So the gap narrowed significantly, right? And by the time Obama was elected, 2008, Chinese GDP was 33% of US GDP. So the gap closed by 100% again. By the time Donald Trump was elected, the Chinese GDP was 61% of US GDP. So all of a sudden, China was the world's 8th largest economy. Now China is the world's 2nd largest economy. So if you are sitting in the Pentagon, in the White House, you have to take notice of this revolutionary change. In history, such dramatic change by the 2nd largest country in the world, the 2nd largest economy in the world, had always resulted in military conflict. So this is, without thinking about Chinese politics, individual leaders in China or individual leaders in the US, when you look at these numbers spell trouble. So this is, and because of this dramatic change in the balance of power between the US and China, you see Chinese behavior and politics changed dramatically as well. The first thing was that China began to devote a lot of resources to its military budget. When you're poor, you cannot spend a lot on your military, but when you are rich, when you're the world's 2nd largest economy, even you spend a smaller share, you're going to spend a lot of absolute dollars. So today, China spends, according to official figures, roughly about $150 billion. The US spends about $600 billion. But China used to spend something like $25 billion. So when you have $150 billion to spend, then you spend on weapon systems that could threaten American troops, American allies. The weapon systems China have acquired with so much investments in its military are missiles, aircraft carrier, advanced aircraft fighter jets bought from Russia or indigenously developed. These capabilities pose enormous worries to the US because the US, if you know about your American military strategy, is always to control air and sea. And these weapons will deny American access to areas around China. So the Chinese military modernization, as a result, of its economic development has raised great concerns in the US. The second change brought out by China's economic growth is that China now has much greater economic influence around the world. 20 years ago, who would imagine that Brazil's biggest trading partner would be China? Inconceivable. Today, Brazil's biggest trading partner is China. I'm talking about areas that used to be American spheres of influence. Our backyard, Latin America. Today, if you go to Latin America, most countries would have China as their largest trading partner because China buys a lot of natural resources from that part of the world, or their second largest trading partner. China probably is their largest lender or investor. And the same is in Africa. Same is in Central Asia. And China's influence, economic influence in Europe has grown a lot. But the area where China's economic influence has made the greatest impact is in East and Southeast Asia, because that's China's neighborhood. So today, every Asian country, including India, has China as their biggest trading partner. Economic influence has strategic implications, because if you depend on China for your economic well-being, are you going to follow the US in terms of security policy? This poses a dilemma for these countries. I was in Australia not too long ago, and Australia may be so far away, but the biggest worry they have today is that China is their biggest trading partner, and the US is their biggest security ally. And the US and China are headed toward strategic competition. So where should Australia stand? So as a result of China's economic influence, the expansion of this influence, I'm not talking about a zero-sum game, but the impact is real. That is, the US influence over its allies or in its strategic, in its spheres of influence has been challenged. And the third development in China is that the argument that economic development, openness to the outside world, close connections with the West will bring about political change in China, will make China more like us. This did not happen. Instead of becoming more like us, the Chinese political system becomes more and more dissimilar to the democratic system. Even though I would say Chinese society today looks more and more like us. There's a disconnect. So, because the Chinese Communist Party, which governs China, now finds a new source of legitimacy. In the past, the Communist Party uses communism as its source of legitimacy. It told the Chinese people that we could lead you to a better future with better values, with more equality and so forth. And that was communism. But today, the Communist Party can easily tell the Chinese people that we deserve to stay in power, even though we're not elected, because we produce very good economic results. And that's true, because China's standard of living has risen dramatically over the last 40 years. The Chinese economy has grown 20-fold in the last 40 years. And no, this is a true economic miracle in the sense that all of a sudden such a large economy has become so big over 40 years. So the Chinese Communist Party actually, by embracing globalization, embracing capitalism, can now stay in power longer. So all of these things have challenged, as a result of economic development, has made the US worry about China and has undermined the case for engagement. And the second reason, the first reason I said dramatic development in China, economic development. The second reason is that Chinese leaders have changed their policy. For about 30 years, the first 30 years of China's reform period, you may say 79 to 2010, the Chinese leaders' policy was very clear. China had to be China had to keep a low profile. China should not challenge American interests because the U.S. was too powerful and China needed the U.S. for economic development. I have to say that without American encouragement and support, China could not have achieved its economic growth at the same rate. China would still be doing very well, would have done very well anyway, but it would not have done as well because the U.S. really helped China a great deal, especially on the trade front. So China's policy began to change around 2008. By that time, China, of course, had acquired a lot more power, but China's leadership began to question whether they should continue to maintain a low profile on foreign policy. And the conclusion was that they should not. Why? 2008, the U.S., the global financial crisis. The U.S. immediately was plunged into the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, and the rest of the West was not doing well economically. So the Chinese leaders concluded that the West was in irreversible decline, and they could now afford to be more assertive without suffering the consequences. So that's one judgment. The second reason was that that was after 2012. China had a new leader, Xi Jinping, who met with Donald Trump in Florida roughly 3 weeks ago. And Mr. Xi is a very different kind of leader from his predecessor. His predecessor was relatively weak, politically, people would say, was not assertive. Mr. Xi is very assertive. He wants to be seen as a very strong leader, and a strong leader takes risks. And one of the risks he takes is foreign policy. He wants to do things his predecessors did not dare to do. And also, he had a new vision for China. Donald Trump's vision is make America great again. Mr. Xi's vision was to make China great again. And how do you make China great again is to give China more international prestige, make China a truly global great power. So he wanted to take more risks. And those risks he took, or he has taken, are the ones that worry the U.S. Let me just single out one very important measure that Mr. Xi has taken. That is building artificial islands in the South China Sea. Because South China Sea, if you recall, is an area where several countries had competing claims. They all claim that they own the South China Sea. The legal truth is nobody owns the South China Sea. China occupied several reefs. These are features that cannot sustain life. But starting in 2013, China began to build very large artificial islands on the basis of those reefs. Spend tons of money. Some of those islands now have runways that can land military jets. So this is a very dramatic escalation in territorial dispute. Suppose you and your neighbor argue over a piece of land between your two properties. But all of a sudden, you begin to put a house on the disputed property. So how would your neighbor react, right? In the Chinese case, China's neighbors are too weak to react. But the only country that can actually make China pay a price is the US. So by taking this step, China puts itself on a course of collision with the US because the South China Sea is very strategic for the world in two senses. About $3 trillion, maybe $6 trillion of commerce goes through the South China Sea. If China controls these vital sea lanes, then China controls the entire East Asian economies. The other is the US maintains its credibility in Asia by reassuring Asian countries that the US will not tolerate aggression in that part of the world. And now China engages in a very aggressive act. And if the US does not react, the US will not be believed in the future. The US will lose its credibility with East Asian allies. So that's why it's vitally important. So what the Chinese leaders have done, as you can see in this particular case, has caused tensions between US and China. And that's the second reason, the leadership policy, leadership change inside China. The third reason is that if you are a one-party system, you can control your internal population. Because one-party systems are very powerful political systems, but their problem is that they always face external political threat. External political threat comes from democracies, successful democracies outside their borders. The US, Europe, these countries show to the Chinese people that there is a better way of governing your country. There are places where individual dignity and rights are respected. So even as the Chinese Communist Party becomes more powerful economically and more successful in terms of maintaining its power internally, the party always sees democracies in the West, and especially the US, the most powerful democracy, as an existential threat. So it never trusts the US, even though China does most of its business with the US. And this lack of political trust, you might even call this ideological conflict, actually makes conflict, real geopolitical conflict between the US and China much more likely. Again, you just think about this. The US has problems with Europe all the time, right? Economic problems, differences over Russia, differences over military spending. But no country, no democratic countries in Europe will see the US as a political threat. The US would not see Europe as a political threat either. But it's very different. Putin, let me just give you another example. Russia's Putin, why does he hate the US so much, resent the US so much? For one simple reason. The US democratic system delegitimizes personal dictatorship in Russia. And the same logic applies to China. So this ideological difference really has a huge impact on US-China relations. And the fourth reason is that in the last 30 some years, China saw a revival of nationalism. This strong pride in Chinese identity, Chinese cultural heritage, and of course, enormous pride in Chinese economic accomplishment. And this strong nationalism has been exploited by the Chinese Communist Party for one simple reason. Because, as I said, the Chinese Communist Party is not an elected ruling party, so it does not have, you might call, democratic legitimacy. It does have you might call economic performance legitimacy, that it has delivered economic growth, but it also wants much more enduring emotional support from the Chinese people, and that's nationalism. In any country, when nationalism becomes very strong, it's very dangerous. And in the Chinese case, that happened in the last 2 to 3 decades, because the Chinese Communist Party wanted to make the Chinese people understand that the West, in particular the US, does not want China to become powerful and strong. The West always has this conspiracy against China. So only the Chinese Communist Party can make China powerful and strong and defend China's national honor and dignity. And this nationalism, if you manipulate nationalism, you can generate xenophobia. You can make a lot of Chinese people really become skeptical, paranoid about the West. The final reason, I'll be very brief, that in this period you saw the decline in the West. I'm talking about social decline, economic decline, either in relative terms and absolute terms. The US still remains very strong militarily. But if you look at American society, American economy, there are lots of problems. So as a result, the US has lost its confidence in dealing with China. When you lose confidence, you tend to react in a much less secure manner. So these are the forces that brought US and China to its fourth period of interaction. And this is the period of strategic competition. Let me end by examining what's happening now. What about Donald Trump's China policy? First, let me talk about the irony. Donald Trump came into office with very strong views. Well, he has strong views on everything, but on China, he has very strong views. And surprise, surprise, the Chinese leaders took him seriously. They were worried that he would do what he said he would do. So they became, all of a sudden, much less assertive on foreign policy. So I would say that in foreign policy, nice guys always finish last. Because when you had Obama, one of the nicest guys in foreign policy, and he was bullied around. But now you have Donald Trump, who is by no means as nice as Obama. He gets his way, at least so far, with China. But if I have to predict what's likely to happen, I think the tough fights are ahead between the US and China, especially between the Obama administration and a Chinese Communist Party led by a very strong leader. I'll focus just on 2 issues as I now wrap up. One is trade. You all know the US runs the largest trade deficit with China, roughly $300 billion. The US and China has more than about $550 billion in trade. So more than, roughly China sells $4 to the US sells $1 to China. So this is the ratio. So there's a huge trade deficit. And Trump wants the deficit to be reduced dramatically or go away. And he uses this as his policy objective. If this objective remains unchanged, there's going to be a train wreck between US and China because those of you who have studied macroeconomics, you know what causes trade deficit. It's not, the most important factors are macroeconomic factors, such as savings rate and consumption. The real reason, let me just put it very simply, why the US runs huge trade deficit with China. The U.S. runs a huge deficit with the rest of the world. One simple reason. The U.S. saves too little and consumes too much. So if you consume more than you produce, where do you buy your consumption? You import, and that is known as trade deficit. That's very simple. Let me just give you one in the U.S., in the case of China and the U.S. The U.S. savings rate, the personal savings rate, is about 5 to 6%. Household savings rate. Chinese household savings rate is 30%. So in other words, you save very little. China saves too much. China has the opposite problem. China saves too much, spends too little. So it does not import. It produces more than it can consume, so it exports. So China has a huge trade surplus. Now the U.S., so China's savings rate is 30% versus the U.S. 6 to 5%. U.S. consumption rate is 70% of GDP. China's consumption rate is 50% of GDP. So the Americans are consuming more, much more than the Chinese. So as long as this picture doesn't change, the U.S. will always run the trade deficit. The trade deficit may not be with China, but the trade deficit will be with other countries. So if President Trump wants to eliminate trade deficit, he cannot do this. The only way he can do this is not by saying that China, you should stop selling us. He will have to tell the American people, don't get your third flat screen. Don't get the fourth car. Don't have two homes. He will actually ask us to tighten our belts and live very frugally. In the long run, that will make the American economy healthy. I think the U.S. economy does need that kind of belt tightening. But in the short term, that will mean, you all know, a recession. And that is not something that he actually is thinking about. So on the trade front, very difficult negotiations lie ahead. There are things he can do to bring down China's trade barrier against American firms. But these trade barriers are all mostly in the service sector. Because Chinese tariffs, tax rates on imports are not very high, except for automobiles. Most barriers are in the financial sector, telecom sector. And if China reduces these barriers, the U.S. will have more service exports to China. But you all know, politically, it does not make much of a difference because it's not going to generate jobs in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, because these are manufacturing centers. So it will be very, very, I think, complicated, to say the least, for Trump to, if he tries to eliminate or dramatically reduce bilateral trade deficits. And now, to make things even more complicated is the situation in North Korea. North Korea is a country that is engaging in activities that can threaten the U.S. directly. It is building nuclear weapons. It has already conducted 5 nuclear tests. It can now produce nuclear weapons as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. And it is developing intercontinental missiles that can reach the U.S. Right now, North Korean missiles probably can reach Japan, but not the U.S. And just imagine a situation in which a rogue state has the capacity to launch nuclear weapons against mainland U.S. Los Angeles, where I live. I cringe, I lose sleep over this. Seattle, or even, God forbid, no Texas, too far away. So for the US, it's an intolerable situation. We will not tolerate. So, but how do you stop it? And China is now where Trump has placed his hope. Because the US has three options. The first option is a military strike. It's very difficult because the North Korean enriched uranium facilities are buried deep under mountains. So you just cannot hit. So you don't even know where they are. So that's the one. But even worse, the North Koreans, they now probably have working nuclear warheads that can hit Japan, hit South Korea. And if you launch a nuclear against Tokyo, the world economy would collapse. So this is a consequence we would not want to take. Of course, North Korea would be gone, right? But that's no comfort for us. And even if there's no nuclear exchange, the North Korean army has about 30,000 artillery pieces dug in along the DMZ that can hit South Korea's capital, Seoul. And that could devastate. I read somewhere, in the first hour, I think the first week, it could kill 64,000 people. That's a risk you don't want to take. This is very different from hitting Syria, which had absolutely no ability to retaliate. The North Koreans are very, very dangerous people with dangerous weapons. So the military option, you can talk about it, but not many people would take it seriously because the consequences are unthinkable. So that's one. So the second option is that you give in. You bribe the North Koreans. So the North Koreans will give you a long list. That diplomatic recognition, peace treaty, non-aggression promise, withdrawal of American troops, no military exercise, economic aid. If you accept that list, you give in to blackmail. No American leader can sign off on that piece of paper because that person probably will be impeached for treason. So that's not an option. The third option, which the US government is now focusing on, is to get China to make the North Koreans stop. Because one way you can stop this program is by suspending tests. Each nuclear test, each missile test improves your knowledge and makes it more likely that you are going to succeed. Right now, there are doubts that the North Koreans can actually turn their nuclear technology or nuclear materials into a warhead. It's very complicated. The only way you can do this is to test. And there's no proof that the North Koreans have mastered the technology of fitting a nuclear head on an intercontinental weapon. So if missile. So if you want to prevent them from doing so, the only way is to stop them from testing. And how do you make them stop? That's where China comes in. Because China is North Korea's largest trading partner. China provides the only source of oil, the only connection to the outside world in terms of internet, so on and so forth. So the belief here is that if China turns up the pressure, the North Koreans will cave in. But the question is, will China do this? China has a very different view on North Korea. For the North Koreans, for China, the North Koreans may be troublemakers, but for the US, but for China, they are strategic allies. Because if you look at the map, North Korea is a strategic buffer between China and the US. Chinese leaders think that if they lose North Korea, if they turn up the pressure and the North Korean economy collapses, the North Korean regime is gone, then the two Koreas will be unified and the American troops will be at the Yalu River. next to China. They will do anything to prevent that from happening. So they are not going to turn up the pressure. But they are also worried that the North Koreans could drag China into a war with the US because China has security treaty with North Korea. And if there's war on the Korean Peninsula, China will be forced to make a choice. So right now, this issue, I just don't see, personally, I don't see how this issue can be resolved. Ideally, if I were in the White House, this is I would propose. Trump will have to talk to Xi and reach a deal and say, if you do A, B, C, I can deliver a promise to you. After the reunification, American troops will be out of the Korean Peninsula. You don't have to worry about American GIs on the border with China. And Korea will be neutral. We guarantee, both of us guarantee Korea's security. But in return of this promise, you cut off everything. And let's jointly produce the collapse of North Korean regime. Well, I'm sure there are smart people both in Beijing and in China, but I have not heard so far such a smart idea. Let me just conclude by saying that as we look ahead at U.S.-China relationship, there are very serious risks that the world's two largest, most powerful countries could get into a Cold War because of trade, because of strategic differences, conflict of power, changing balance of power, and then differences over places like North Korea. President Trump has an opportunity, but he doesn't seem to have a strategy yet in dealing with China. He's too transactional. He looks at this relationship as a series of deals. You actually need to have a bigger picture. And as long as we don't have that big picture, then the future is very, very uncertain. Thank you very much. We have about 8 minutes.
Please wait for the microphone if you have a question.
Yeah, raise your hand if you have a question. I'll bring the mic to you.
So, okay. Considering the protectionist path that we seem to be on, a trade war seems pretty inevitable at this point. So if that were to happen, and we see an even quicker change of basically who's the number one economy, there's been comparisons of Mr. Xi being compared to, at least in vision, to Mao Zedong. Do you think, as far as the power hunger, will China become more of a warmongering colonialist, as we pretty much have been in this, trade of economy?
Yeah. Well, here we talk about two issues. One is what happens if there were a trade war between the U.S. and China, and then what happens to China's foreign policy posture if there were a trade war? So two different issues. Let me first deal with U.S.-China trade war, should there such a thing occur. It all depends on, because trade war is very vague. What is trade war, right? How do you define a trade war? Because the U.S. has a range of options. Some of them will hurt China more than the U.S. Some of them will hurt both equally. Some of them will hurt only the U.S. and not China. So you really have to look at what specifically will be done. So in other words, nobody knows the answer yet. Okay. But overall, a trade war will cause more problem for China than the U.S., simply because China depends a lot more on exports than the U.S. does. But let's just, if you are making foreign policy, trade policy in Washington, what you worry is whether it is going to hurt or help your base. What's really troubling in talking about trade war with China is that if there were a trade war, the people who thought they could bring back jobs will be disappointed because those jobs are not going to come back. So whether China will continue its foreign policy posture if U.S.-China relationship becomes very adversarial, it all depends on where. I think China will become much more, China will change its policy. It will pick off those countries that it sees can be allies, but it will probably be moderate in other areas. For example, in Southeast Asia, maybe China will be much more restrained.
More questions? Well, thank you. Let's oh, is there one over here? Oh, there's one over here.
Yes.
Thank you. I guess this is more of a microeconomics
Yes.
question in regards to China. I've been reading some articles, and one of the articles is referring to the way of living in China, more towards the elderly. They're living in, caged homes, no more bigger than, twice the size of a dog cage, and they're going the same price of a, regular apartment here in the U.S. And there's another article where a Chinese student who graduated from New York University as a project went to China and worked at an Apple phone producing factory, where all he did every day for 12 hours a day was to screw in one bolt into a phone. Do you think, these are certain externalities that China has used to progress, or do you think there's a better way to go about it?
Yeah, I think you talked about two issues in China. One is very high housing prices in large cities. If a Chinese individual who comes from Shanghai or Beijing to Tech City, his apartment probably can buy 5 houses here because the prices there are New York level, London level, just ridiculously high prices. And high housing prices have made it very difficult for poor people in China to afford reasonable spaces. And I have read even worse. Now, I have not read cage space. I have read that people are living in bomb shelters, dug in the 60s, because they could not afford an apartment. The second one is, I don't think it's true what you've read is that a New York graduate, NYU graduate, would go to China and work in Apple assembly lines. Those Apple assembly lines employ almost exclusively people in their 20s from the countryside. China does have a problem of finding good jobs for its college graduates. China today graduates more college graduates than the US. China every year graduates about 7 million students, half of them with 4-year degrees, half of them with 3-year degrees. The US is about 3 million. So China graduates a lot more than double. The problem with China is that they cannot find good jobs that would match their aspirations and skills. Okay.
John. Well, thank you very much. We're out of time. So it's 1:30. So thank you so much.
Thank you.